When I started learning Japanese in college a decade ago, one of the things I hoped to do eventually was to be able to play the classic games of my childhood in their original language, since there is always something lost in translation, and I loved some of those games so much that I wanted to find out what those things were. Once I was finally able to play those games in Japanese, I noticed so many interesting differences from the English scripts that I'd all but memorized with repeated playthroughs over the years. But it wasn't until I played Final Fantasy IX in Japanese for the first time that I decided to start this translation analysis series, where I will be comparing the English and Japanese scripts of the game. Now, in my opinion, Final Fantasy IX actually had the first truly great English translation in the series, so perhaps at first glance, it's not the most obvious choice for a project like this. It certainly might have been easier to use one of the older games with more flawed translations and clear mistakes that are just begging you to poke fun at them. But I assure you there's still plenty of fascinating riches to be found in analyzing the largely stellar English translation of Final Fantasy IX. Because of course, stellar or great doesn't mean flawless or perfect. An experience in both translating and reading translations tells me that there is no such thing as a perfect translation that completely captures and conveys the entire essence of the original work. Translations are always a compromise, and as I alluded to before, there's always bits and pieces lost in the process. And, as it just so happens, despite Final Fantasy IX's English translation being among the best in the series, it still has plenty of those bits and pieces. Now, there's various reasons for that. Some instances are just a natural consequence of the localization process, or the translator's personal interpretation and choices, while others are due to the strict character limit on the text boxes of these PlayStation 1 JRPGs, which force translators to shrink or even omit certain lines in order to be able to get the overall message across, since much more often than not, English needs far more characters than Japanese in order to say the same thing. This may even have been the reason why one of the playable characters' names was changed altogether, but we'll get to that. Now, before we start, I'd just like to share two brief disclaimers with you. One, I've received formal education on both translation and the Japanese language, which I've studied for many years now. But just like translations themselves, I'm not perfect, nor a Japanese teacher or a master of the language. I'm fluent enough to play games and read stories in it, but naturally, I'm still capable of making mistakes like everyone else. So, if you understand Japanese as well and happen to spot any, feel free to go ahead and let me know. I'd appreciate it. Number two, whenever I point out a difference between the English and Japanese scripts, it's best to keep in mind that there is a difference between the change itself and my opinion on the change. The change is what it is, and I'm just pointing out that it's there. But my opinion on the change is my own, and you don't have to agree with it. I might think something was changed for the worse, but you might prefer how the English version did it, and that's totally cool with me. All I hope is that you find the overall analysis process to be interesting, enlightening, and entertaining. Who knows, perhaps by becoming more familiar with the original script, your understanding of the characters may even expand a little, and you may find an even deeper appreciation for them and this marvelous game as a whole. I sure did when I first played Final Fantasy IX in Japanese, which is precisely why I'm inspired to now share that journey with you. Alright, I think that covers everything, so without further ado, let us dive deep into Vagrant Chocobo's Final Fantasy IX translation analysis. As it just so happens, Final Fantasy IX is so literary that there are lines to analyze before we even press the New Game button. I'm referring, of course, to the title cards depicting the playable characters, accompanied by a word and a line attributed to each one. These lines give us a glimpse into the kind of people they are and what their defining traits or chief concerns might be. And even though they were a bit more liberally translated than the rest of the script, they do end up conveying more or less the same ideas and sentiments. There is one, however, that stands out to me, and that's my boy Vivi. In English, his line is, "How do you prove that you exist? Maybe we don't exist." Now, I don't know about you, but personally, that line never really impressed me too much. I mean, it kinda sounds like something you might read in Jaden Smith's Twitter feed, you know? Like an immature kid trying a little too hard to sound deep and philosophical. But as luck would have it, the Japanese version of the line reads quite differently. and in my opinion feels more like a natural concern of Vivi's rather than a contrived attempt at ontological musings about whether we truly exist or not. I mean, for starters, as is often the case in Japanese, no subject is specified and no personal pronoun is used, so you wouldn't even necessarily use the word we. In fact, I say we sounds too broad and generic for this line, and makes it sound like Vivi is talking about people or living beings as a whole, when he's actually referring to his specific existence as a black mage, who, you know, are pretty complicated beings in Final Fantasy IX. I think that becomes clear with the way the line is phrased in Japanese. 生きてるってことを証明できなければ死んでしまっているのと同じなのかな. A possible English translation would be, I wonder, if you can't prove you're alive, does that mean you might as well be dead? You could even have Vivi use I instead of an impersonal you, which is actually what a Japanese book called Final Fantasy IX Visual Arts Collection does. Even though it's a Japanese book, it contains English translations of those lines that are far more literal and faithful to the original, although they probably weren't translated by native English speakers, since they do possess grammar mistakes, sometimes to hilarious results. But it's still curious to note that they did use I for Vivi's line, further hinting that he was indeed talking about himself and not we as a whole. And much like the word we, I don't think the word exist works very well here. If Vivi had said sonzai suru, then maybe, but he said ikiteru, which is definitely closer to living or being alive, and makes much more sense for Vivi since, as we find out eventually, spoilers, in Final Fantasy IX, black mages like him are actually man-made golems produced from the mist and designed to be soulless dolls so they can be used as tools of war. So, in a way, Vivi might truly be unable to formally prove that he is alive, since, as an artificially produced creature made from the mist, he could easily lack some of the biological components of organisms we traditionally consider to be living beings. Sorta like a mechanical android in a sci-fi story, which is why I feel the Japanese line works better and is actually rather touching. You know, Vivi is casting doubt on whether he can even be considered a living being, rather than doubting our existence as a whole. But hey, maybe these lines in the title cards were the very first thing the translators worked on, and they just weren't aware of the dark places where this cute little boy's story would go. Anyway, we should probably press new game already. I don't want to write an entire volume before the game even begins. Final Fantasy IX's narrative hook is a tried and true classic tale. A merry band of thieves are going to be kidnapping a princess, and our first scene of dialogue is them going over the details of this royal abduction. Zidane is of course our protagonist, with the other members of Tantalus being more secondary and supporting characters, but you can still tell each one has their own style and personality just from the way they're lying about the room. But not only that, they also have interesting little speech quirks that also help them make them stand apart. However, these can be a little difficult to adapt into English, which is why they sometimes just weren't. For example, Marcus ends his lines by adding su to the end of certain words. Wedge from Final Fantasy VII and Watts from Final Fantasy VIII also spoke in this manner before him, and in Final Fantasy X, the main character Tidus went on to do so as well. Su is a contraction of desu, and is basically a more casual and less stiff way of sounding polite than the conventional Japanese polite forms. This, coupled with the fact that Marcus is also the only member of the band to address his Tantalus peers with the honorific san, whose approximate equivalent in English is Mr. or Mrs., could mean that he might be the youngest or newest member of the group, hence him addressing the others with a somewhat more respectful tone and manner of speech. And of course, you can't really glimpse any of that from his English dialogue, which kinda goes to show you just how much detail about the characters and their relationships can be conveyed or hinted in Japanese through speech and dialogue. Incidentally, Ruby, the sole female member of Tantalus, who can actually appear in this scene if you give Baku the wrong answer 50 times, I don't recommend it, it's a painful process. She speaks with a Kansai accent, the Japanese dialect from the Osaka and Kyoto regions, which in anime and games is usually given to characters that are meant to talk funny. This is usually localized to English as a North American Southern accent, and Ruby is no different. Other Final Fantasy characters that talk like this, at times anyway, include Ketchi, or Kate Sif, from Final Fantasy VII, and Selfie from Final Fantasy VIII, but those weren't properly or consistently localized, not really. Ruby, however, was! Isn't she lucky she's in the best PS1 Final Fantasy? I mean, best translated PS1 Final Fantasy. Actually, both those statements are true. Anyway, after the thieves wrap up their meeting, their ship arrives in Alexandria, which is where this tale truly begins, and where our tale of translation gets busier and crazier. So, you can look forward to the next episode, where we'll be taking a look at Vivi's adventures as a slave, and speculating about an odd and unlikely origin for his name. See you next time, Chocobros!